Hello, I am Charlene Martin from Painesville High School. I teach in a high school ELA classroom. I teach grades 9 through 12, and this is specifically geared toward my Honors English 2 class. So many of us encountered issues during pandemic teaching, the time when we quickly moved online and had to have some way to connect with our students while they were working at home. So some of my problems of practice result from that time period, but I also observed commonalities before it even started. So one of the things I was looking for was the ability to be very flexible in the classroom with absences, especially this school year as we were coming back, concerned about the need for numerous quarantines and students being able to catch up with work and being out for extended period of time and still being able to work on assignments while they were at home, as well as being able to come back into the classroom and easily get caught up. There's a need for flexibility on the part of meeting students where they were after a period of time of being out of the classroom and sometimes not even seeing these particular kids or meeting them in person. So putting an emphasis on being able to close any kind of learning gaps and address needs that they had coming into the classroom and adjusting after having such flexibility at home for a long period of time. Prior to the pandemic, however, I was curious about how we can better engage students in 21st century learning than what our traditional classrooms sometimes allow for. So being able to meet with students individually and pull them up for conference time, whether conferencing on their writing or meeting with individuals or small groups of students to offer additional help. I had actually looked into the Modern Classroom project before KVEC offered the grant for classrooms this summer. And I had worked through the online course that is free for all teachers. When the opportunity arose to be able to work with KVEC in this, I was excited because it meant that I could also work with a mentor and I could ask individual questions about how that process worked in their classroom, how they made the transition themselves using these steps that are clearly identified on their website. So using the 4 steps that are identified here, and then the 5th step was actually launching the program. There's an emphasis on mastery-based learning, blended instruction, self-paced structures in the classroom, and a learning design and organizational model. So I'm going to walk through how I have incorporated these steps into my classroom to get started for this new school year. The first step was to actually practice that backwards lesson planning design that we all learn and initiate as we're in our teacher prep programs. So the very first step was starting with the mastery check. What was it that I wanted students to be able to do by the time that we finished a lesson? In order to do that, we start with the learning objectives or the learning targets for the standards that we're working with. For this particular lesson that I had submitted as part of my Summer Institute program, I actually was working with a couple of different standards, and the recommendation is to choose one, but these 2 went very closely together. So looking at the objectives of being able to explain a narrative structure and to be able to explain the effect of that structure also played into a requirement for that particular honors course taken from the AP Lit and Composition CED that talks about being able to explain function of point of view in a narrative. So this one actually had a lot of depth to it as we moved through our course, and it was one of the foundations for analytical writing and reading. As you complete the mastery check, this is just kind of a template that Modern Classrooms project actually provided. It has, of course, the lesson listed at the top and the focus for that lesson with the objectives written out again. And then the mastery checks are very short. They're almost like what you would think of with exit slips or quizzes in a classroom on a daily basis. However long your lesson is going to be, this mastery check would be a check of their progress as they actually learn that skill and are able to now demonstrate it on their own. And so this is the end game for the individual lesson. You also, of course, want to think about the criteria for mastery. How will we know that students have actually achieved what it is that we're trying to teach in that particular lesson? So Modern Classrooms project encourages us to use a system of rubrics and to be able to communicate with students how they know that they have mastered a skill versus they may have some revision that's still needed. And this, of course, again, is for the mastery check and not individual practice that kids would do in class along the way. The third step for this particular portion was to create activities so that students can develop the understanding of those particular skills. I had several parts to that, and I have taken snippets from each one just to show that I started with a pre-writing process and asked kids to show me kind of what they were capable of in the beginning. And then I used a process of instructional videos with guided notes and brought in another video clip that was from outside my instruction, and then had students answer questions in order to kind of deeper develop that particular skill that we were working on. And then finally, I asked them to do some peer revision and editing on their work. So they returned back to that very first pre-writing that they did. And I was asking them to work with a partner in order to clarify any of their thinking and discuss how they could now identify more deeply and answer a response to that particular question. So as they returned to it, their mastery check at that particular level was being able to produce a piece of writing that was analytical in nature and address the first question they were introduced to. The fourth step is to create a plan for revision and having some kind of plan in mind for reassessment for students. So if they were working through their practice as they should, by the time they get to that mastery check, they should be able to show how they have progressed through that particular lesson. But we all know that by the time they get to the mastery check, there are going to be some of those students who would still need to have some revision work or may need to actually reassess on a mastery check they didn't perform well on. So I actually had a couple of policies in place as we were guided to do in the Summer Institute for Modern Classroom Project program. And then I have a mastery check form, Google form, that I could set up and use within the classroom so that students were actually telling me what it was they did not perform well on, and it required them to actually self-reflect. And then they had to tell me what they were going to do in order to correct that misunderstanding or the lack of skills that they had. So were they going to go back and practice work that they had skipped initially that they thought maybe they already knew? Were they going to go back and watch new videos? Did they need new practice from me? What was the step that they were going to take? Even if it involved extra tutoring, they could actually write that up so that I would see their plan before they were able to take a reassessment. The reassessment is a redesign of a particular mastery check. It would be an additional mastery check that was waiting for students who needed this particular step. The point of reassessment is not to give them the same test and maybe have them do test corrections or add on to what they already had. It's to recreate an experience for them so that they can show new mastery in a different way. So a couple of the questions that guided my process to be able to put these policies in place were questions that they had asked in the Summer Institute, which included: how will a student be given the opportunity to improve his or her work through the feedback and revision process? And then once they actually revised, when and how would they be able to demonstrate mastery? And so that was some of the stuff that I had to think about ahead of time. When would I plan for students to be able to come in after school, or would I work that into the classroom? That involved a little bit of planning and communicating to students ahead of time at the beginning of the year. The second overall step in the components of a mastery, of a modern classroom, is to be able to design your own instructional videos. And so using these particular packages, whether it be Screencast-O-Matic, Screencastify, or Loom, teachers were already used to recording some of their own videos for the most part during the time that we were at home during the pandemic. And so taking this step and adding to it in order to develop better instructional videos was something that we did through the process of the Summer Institute. So some of the tips that I got from that would be to keep the videos really short. Research shows that 6 to 9 minutes is kind of the prime time to be able to still engage students and keep their interest. And so if I were developing a longer topic, then that would allow, then I would need to divide the topic up into separate videos. Using some kind of program that allowed you to display your face on the screen as you instructed students. Research shows is also a very vital part of being effective in keeping student engagement. Being able to read your body language, being able to read your lips, all of these things became critical for students in successful programs. And so these are things that the Modern Classroom Project tries to encourage students to, or teachers to continue. We have a tendency sometimes when students watch our videos to want to speak slowly to kind of control and encourage them in their pacing a little bit, but the research also shows that having a conversational pace is actually much better, and you could even speed it up a little bit more because students have the ability to come back and rewatch scenes as they need to. Number 4 is about increasing engagement and having students do something to be active in the process. So allowing students to take notes that are guided notes in some way, or to use some software packages that would allow you to build in some questioning, are a couple of things that Modern Classrooms Project encourages teachers to include. Not stressing over having a perfect video. This one is still very hard for me, even in producing this video, because I have a tendency to want to stop or replay certain sections so that I can fix errors that I have, but they encourage us to leave them in because it's very much capturing what it would be like to be in a classroom situation where you may stumble over words, get tongue-tied, and it just creates a little bit of a more realistic feel for students and helps them to see a little bit of that humanity. And so it's something that they encourage, and it also helps you to save on your time. You do not have time to go back and keep reproducing videos. The next one on the list is to use the Animate feature, and this is something that's really helpful in the videos that I produce for class. Instead of showing all of this at one time on the screen, I would actually have it pop up one after the other so that I could control a little bit of what students are seeing and giving them little bits rather than writing out in long text every word that I would want to say during the video. This captures a screenshot of one of the videos that I produced early on. And so you can see this one has my face in the screen as I instruct. My face is there the entire time. I also have displayed the learning objectives for that particular lesson so that as we open, I explain clearly what it is for students, and I start with some kind of engaging question to begin with after this slide. And then also enhancing the videos in some way, using Edpuzzle to build in questions, or like I did on this one, there were certain notes or reminders. If I wanted to remind students to have their cell phones turned off, if I wanted to remind them to write down a certain part, if I actually needed, if I forgot to put something in my video and I wanted to add it, then I could just have it pop up as a note on the screen. So all of those are ways to make sure that students are actually watching the videos and engaging in that process. And again, we want to keep the videos under 9 minutes. So you can see this one was at 8 minutes and 15 seconds. Deciding how you want students to interact with those videos, of course, becomes important initially to build those practice assignments. This is an example of one that I used with guided notes. So as students watch the explanation of this process that you see on the screen, they were actually filling in an analytical paragraph that then became a model for them to use later on as they built their own. This is an example taken from my experimentation that was encouraged through Modern Classrooms Project Summer Institute. And it is through the app Explain Everything, which works really well with an iPad and an Apple Pencil. And you can actually go through and mark on your slides or annotate text for students on the screen live as you work and build your video. So in this one, you could see that I was able to highlight different parts of the text in order to help them create analytical paragraphs. And then I'm able to write on the screen directly as I need to. After creating the initial Explain Everything video, I came back and embedded it into Edpuzzle and built in some questions to go along with it. This one is at the end, and I'm just trying to gauge students' reactions as far as if they were able to make sense of the video, if they felt like they still needed help with something, and it was an area for them to quickly be able to give me feedback. I will say that Explain Everything was an app I had not used prior to this program, and I absolutely love it. Being able to use it even in the classroom live and projecting on the screen is a really nice feature. The third step in the overall process was to build a self-pacing plan. So this is one where we were required to look at each lesson in our unit and determine which lesson would be a must do, should do, or aspire to do, and to be able to have some kind of justification for that. We also had an emphasis on tracking students' progress as they moved through the lessons. And that was a way to let them know where they were in the process. But it was also, if you choose to use a public progress tracker, it was a way for students to know where everyone else was. It wasn't tied to any kind of grade or any kind of specific feedback. It was just simply, here's where other students are in the room, so that if you needed to get help from a student, you know who to go to who's already completed that particular process. And then there were deliberate attempts to make sure that you had relationship building and that you had collaborative opportunities built in for students as they work. This was something in my classroom that I found as I went through, I didn't really need the progress checker as much because my class one was really small. And the second thing was that they already had relationships built and they were able to call upon each other anytime they needed something. So that interaction was authentic and it was already there. This was my list of must do, should do, and aspire to do assignments. This takes us through the first 16 days of the lesson, and you'll see that they were color coded, and that color coding actually translated to the progress tracker that I had on display in the classroom. So that's how they would know which assignments they needed to do. Once I pulled back from the progress tracker a little bit, because it was already in Infinite Campus for them to use, it was already marked in Canvas, and I found that process to be a little bit redundant. Then I needed to pass this out to them and code everything on Canvas so that they would be able to see which assignments they were working through, which ones were required, and which ones they could skip if they needed to because they were already comfortable. You can see over in the lesson classification where I'm actually justifying how each part works. The must do are those assignments that actually they're going to build skills that are needed for the mastery check. The should do's are not necessarily needed for the mastery check. They could still have success without doing them, but it would provide more practice and give them a little bit more in-depth instruction. And then the aspire to do's were times that I used for enrichment and for being able to create creative assignments to give students an opportunity to express themselves maybe in ways they weren't able to in class so far, or to go the extra mile and create some kind of a project or something that maybe was more based on something they were interested in. The third one was creating the progress tracking system itself. This is one that was offered up in our Summer Institute program. And I really liked the way that it worked because I could type the student names in. And then as you set the dates and as students are actually actively working, you can let them know publicly where everybody is, and you can let the individual student know if they were on pace or behind pace. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing if they were behind pace. It was just simply, this is where we are. You're taking a little bit longer on this pace. But what I found was that those students then knew that they could cut certain assignments that they didn't need in the future. Maybe some of the aspire to do work that would be a little bit more time consuming for them. Maybe they could figure out ways to do that in ways that were more time effective for them. And so it was really used more for the planning than it was to say, you know, shame on you, you're not on pace and you should be more advanced right now than you are. It wasn't for that purpose. So I found this to be a helpful tracking system. And then the very last step was designing a plan for learning. So this is where you think about the learning management system that you're going to use. Our school district actually uses Google Classroom since the pandemic, but I prefer the free teacher account on Canvas simply because it offered me a little bit more control. You also in this section would think about how you set up the physical classroom, how your desks are going to be arranged, where students might take mastery checks, where you're going to store all of the handouts that you might have to give out. Are you going to store any physical handouts, or will everything be based on the electronic LMS? So these are all things that you start thinking about before you have students in the room, plan out and have as part of your procedures so that you can go over in the first week or so with students. For Canvas, I found that I was able to set up a module so that students were required to complete all of the items. So they had to work through each lesson one by one and do whatever I had set for them to finish with that particular assignment. So on lesson 1.1, you can see that students had to actually make a submission online. And when they made the submission, then it would open up lesson 1.2. So they would not see everything listed all at one time, which helps a little bit with those students who get really overwhelmed at seeing a large bunch of information for them to process and many assignments that they're going to have to get done by the time they get to the end. Lesson 1.2 actually requires them just to view something. So this was an optional assignment because it was a should do. I'm asking them to review literary elements that they would have gone over in years past. And then if they felt confident, or if they went over some of those and felt like they didn't need to continue, then they could back out at any time. All they were required to do here was actually view the assignment. On lesson 1.3, they had to mark the assignment as done. So this is where they watched the video, but their work was actually embedded. The questions were in Edpuzzle, so that as they worked through that Edpuzzle, they had stopping points where it would bring up a certain question that they asked, and then I would go into Edpuzzle to actually grade those questions.